When Cuphead came out, it was nothing short of a worldwide sensation. In a sea of open-world RPGs and FPS games, we got something that was truly innovative, but ironically takes in a design from something that kind of predates video games altogether. It was stylish, it had charm, and despite its difficulty, felt really rewarding to play, especially for fans of the old Disney cartoons. Now, I was born in the late 90s, and since my family's cable subscription didn't have Disney Channel on it, I grew up with mostly Cartoon Network and Nickelodeon. So many of the shows I was exposed to include Scooby-Doo, Dexter's Laboratory, Powerpuff Girls, and many others that are too numerous to name. The important thing to note is that Cuphead's style was based on cartoons that I had very little exposure to, so my excitement for it at the time wasn't really as big, although I still thought the idea was ingenious and unique. It's been 7 years since Cuphead was released, and now I finally got to play a game that takes a similar approach but is a lot closer to what I grew up with. This game is called
#Blood, the video game.
One look at #Blood will tell you everything you need to know about the style of this game. I was super excited to play it, and I'll be giving some of my thoughts on the experience. Do check out my other stuff as well, as I make both reviews and video essays on various games, and like and subscribe if you like what you see. Now, I'll keep this as spoiler-free as possible, but overall there is a lot to love in this game, but also some aspects that might turn off a few people, so make sure to watch until the end before deciding to buy the game or not. First, let's take a look at the visuals. This game is absolutely stunning. I can't help but gush at how it looks because the design of the world, the characters, and the animations for literally everything are freaking perfect. I don't want to exaggerate or anything, but it's really obvious that the devs gave their heart and soul into ensuring that all the cutscenes, combat sequences, character reactions, and even the random background items and animals in the map are like a Saturday morning cartoon. It's so charming and nostalgic that I can't praise it enough, and taking a quick look at who the devs are, we can easily see why. Exit 73 Studios is actually an animation studio that focuses a lot on cartoons, and they've made quite a bit of work in 2D frame-by-frame animation for people like Jimmy Fallon, for Nick Jr., and a bunch of other projects. Hence, the use of this type of art style for #Blood. Now, the art style and animation are spot on, but it helps that the characters are also very likable and that the plot, albeit a little cliche, is quite fun as well. Your main character is a young freshman in high school named Becky Brewster, who just recently moved into her mom's hometown of Carpentersville. However, it seems like there's some weird stuff about to go down, which may or may not involve a vampire invasion, and it's going to be up to Becky to defeat them. Along the way, you meet her warm and loving dad, her new nerdy inventor friend named Corey, and a bunch of other students in her school that all have very unique and funny personalities. I also like how the game references a lot of modern trends, and I cannot emphasize enough how grateful I am that they executed it in a way that wasn't cringe as f. For example, Becky can take selfies with her phone, and it's genuinely really cute and can be really funny, especially since you can do it mid-combat with enemies as well. They introduced a social media app called Perch, which is an oddly familiar bird-based app, although I guess the real one isn't a bird anymore, but whatever. And they also add a little bit of social satire without being too contrived or pushy about it, so again, it becomes a little bit more entertaining rather than cringy. There are some things that might be worth noting though, and one is that the pacing of the story can be a little jarring at times, especially in the beginning. The game is short, and although there are a few side missions you can do, you can easily finish the main story in around 10 to 12 hours. This can be hit or miss for some people because on one hand, I personally felt that the main story's length was just fine. It doesn't overstay its welcome, and it doesn't pad the game too much with unnecessary content, and has some great moments. However, I did find that it did lean just a bit too far on the concise side of things, as I found myself wanting more depth on some of the side characters, the world, and Becky's life as a high schooler as well. We're told that she plays field hockey, that her dad works at Perch, and that there are certain school events that pop up throughout the school year that she needs to attend, but a lot of these aren't really explored as much as I would have liked. They mostly played as more of a backdrop to the vampire slaying part of the story, and I would have liked a little more depth to them. There was one chapter of the game where it tries to focus on that high schooler aspect a bit more, but it ends quite abruptly. Again, this can be good or bad depending on your preference. Persona is a good example of a series where some people are a fan of the extensive life simulator content that you can do, while others don't really like it as much and might prefer to skip all of that to get to the action more. Again, I personally feel like #Blood kinda stepped a little too far on that latter part of the spectrum, and it could have put a little bit more time into world building and side stories. But overall, I don't think it's a big deal breaker, and it's something that they can work on further should there be a sequel. Another issue is that the world feels strangely disconnected from the main plot. This is linked to my concern around the world building, wherein there are major things that happen in the story that you expect should affect or garner the attention of the wider community of Carpentersville, yet nobody ever really talks about it or reacts. And it's not as if the events are all completely secret. Some create actual fiascos that could warrant media attention or at least some posts on the in-game social media app, but there's just nothing. The main plot seems to be happening in isolation of the world, and it honestly takes me out of the immersion of it. The gameplay is also a little bit of a mixed bag, and it's understandable if it ends up turning off some players. First, in terms of the UI, the menu is done through Becky's phone and the objectives are integrated into Perch, the social media platform that I mentioned earlier. Unfortunately, even though it can be entertaining at times, as other followers can kind of comment on the quests you're doing, it's not a very good way to track objectives. In fact, the menu itself can be a little confusing in the beginning, but you do kind of get used to it as you keep playing. This feels like an attempt by the devs to be creative, and that's really commendable, don't get me wrong. For example, I like how the main objective will just have a quest marker, but generally it's just to guide you to the location, and it's up to you to figure out what you need to do to complete your objectives, and that's great. I like that approach, but some objectives can be a little too vague. And sometimes they can be a little tedious, as many tasks do require you to kind of run around the location to collect stuff or complete puzzles. There's also this tendency to make these puzzles more challenging by sprinkling in enemies that spawn constantly, but I'm not a big fan of that approach, and fortunately it doesn't happen often. I've also felt like I've taken the map button in many games for granted, because here you have to manually scroll through the phone menu to get to the map every single time. I don't know if I just got spoiled by other games, but this should be a given by now, especially since the select button on my controller isn't even mapped to anything. There's also a lot of strangely misleading tabs in the menu where I thought they would play a significant role in the gameplay, but are mostly just filler, with information that's largely insignificant to the gameplay or to the combat. Speaking of combat, this is where things get truly frustrating. The thing is, it's not something I can outright describe as bad, it's just inconsistent. Like, I love how the enemy variety in the game is so extensive. By the end, you are fighting so many different types of vampires with various attack patterns and weaknesses, and when paired with the amazing visuals and animation, it keeps these encounters fresh. But Becky's range of moves and skills are very limited. The game technically gives you more skills later on, but they're either limited by ammo or limited in applicable uses. Your main weapon remains the same all throughout, and it only has one 3-move combo that you will keep using throughout your playthrough, which can make the combat feel a little repetitive, especially since this is the best way to beat enemies. It's the most powerful. The boss fights are also incredibly fun and varied, both in design and in mechanics, making them a big highlight in this game in my opinion. But the game does it in a way here where it ramps up the spectacle after each chapter, and this makes sense as some skills needed for future encounters are obtained later on. So the initial 1 or 2 bosses might be a little meh, but once you get through those, the rest of the bosses are actually quite good. The combat is fast-paced because enemies tend to come in large groups or waves. But, and I think this is the most egregious but in this game, the dodge mechanic feels flawed. For context, enemies in this game damage upon contact regardless if they are attacking or not. So getting surrounded is a real danger as movement becomes limited. So the instinct here is of course to dodge and create space, right? Fortunately, the dodge does not have iframes. So if your spatial awareness isn't perfect or if you're surrounded, you will be constantly dodging into enemies or into boss attacks. The latter can be a bit of a problem as bosses tend to be big and have quick attacks that are hard to telegraph, so even if you dodge the attack, you'll somehow end up dodging into their leg or whatever random body part or appendage or something, which, I'm not gonna lie, can be quite annoying. The last one I'll mention is that there is a bit of a lag before you can do a dodge after an attack combo, and it's long enough that if you do a combo while in a group of enemies, it's highly likely you won't be able to dodge in time before getting hit. Now, I acknowledge that this may be a deliberate choice along with the iframes to make one more careful when it comes to using dodges and finishing combos, but there's just something slightly off with the balancing. If the goal is to make one more deliberate and slow down a person's urge to spam attack and dodge, then enemies and bosses need to telegraph a lot more clearly to allow players to learn attack patterns. Some enemies do this, but some don't, or at least act too quickly for players to react, which leads to an instinctive dodge that inevitably leads to contact with another enemy. If the goal was to make combat more fast-paced, kinda like what you'd see in Hades, then iframes will be a good addition, and having more moves and combos will also make the game's action feel more fun and dynamic. Now, it could very well be that I just suck at the game, and I haven't figured out the most effective strategy, in which case, do let me know if this is just my problem and that you have no problem with this type of combat. Overall, even if I can gush over the visuals and animation, the gameplay aspects I've mentioned prevent the game from being great. I would still recommend it for people, especially those who grew up with these types of cartoons, and the price isn't too expensive. But of course, that's subjective and dependent on your geography and price sensitivity. In my eyes though, this feels more like a proof of concept, and I'm cutting the devs more slack because this is their first game. And it's very impressive since their expertise is mostly on animation for various cartoons. I still really enjoyed the game, but I hope they can smoothen out some of the rough parts in the future sequel, or maybe even in a patch or expansion or whatever future game they want to do. Do check out the game for yourself though, as it's out now on PC, Xbox, PlayStation, and Nintendo Switch, and do let me know what you guys think down in the comments. This is Sai from The Fireplace, and I hope to see you all again really soon.